Stephen Guilbeault. Now, he also says that by cutting methane emissions, it is one of the fastest ways to address climate change. And for some reaction, we're now joined by the Minister of Justice for Saskatchewan, Bronwyn Eyre. Minister, good to see you again. Thank you for taking the time.
Lovely to be here. Thank you.
Listen, I want to begin with the equivalency agreement that Saskatchewan has with Ottawa, because for people who don't know, that does allow provincial methane regulations to have precedence over federal regulations if it achieves the same goal. So I'm wondering how these draft regulations would affect that agreement.
Well, I think that's a major problem. And keep in mind, we have, as you say, an equivalency agreement with the federal government on methane. It was hard negotiated for. It took some 2 years to get to an agreement in the fall of 2020. And basically, the equivalency agreement was the federal government accepting Saskatchewan's Methane Action Plan, or MAP, whose goals were 40 to 45% reduction in methane emissions from 2015 levels by 2025. And we've already achieved that. So in December 2021, Minister Guilbeault, not yet Environment Minister Guilbeault, praised us and publicly congratulated Saskatchewan on Twitter for having reduced methane emissions by 50%. And that was all on our own. That was not with the help of the federal government. So we have honored the agreement, an agreement that, as you say, we had with the federal government. And very shortly after that announcement by Minister Guilbeault, the goalposts started to change. And the signal started to go out around, it was going to be 60 or it was going to be 75. And of course, that's what we are seeing now being formalized today. But the point is that we have an agreement in place. It expires next year. And so this is more of that changing of goalposts, which we see so often, and really doesn't send a very positive signal when there's talk about how collaboration is important between the federal government and the provinces, when midway through an agreement, the rules have changed. We saw it coming, but we're disappointed to see it formalized today.
So what is the practical impact of that then? Because here you have an announcement out of COP28. You're already working on one set of principles. So what's your concern about the impact that would have on industry?
Well, the first thing is uncertainty. And it just is another impact that the sector has to absorb in terms of not being sure what the framework is, not being sure what the regulations are going to be. And how many times have we seen that? The point of the equivalency agreement was to provide some certainty. Industry stakeholders were in favor of it. They've obviously done a good job with the province in reducing emissions. That was above what we had even said would be in the equivalency agreement at the 40 to 45%. 50% reductions we saw by 2021. So I think the real concern is that this is a cap by default, a production cap by default. And we've seen very cautious language by the federal minister around honoring provincial jurisdiction and how that is something that needs to be respected. But the point is, this actually violates provincial jurisdiction under the Constitution. And keep in mind that in the carbon tax case, the Supreme Court found that the pricing stringency was a very, very narrow and specific thing in terms of emissions pricing. And it was indicated at that point by the court that the federal government would have to be very, very cautious about entering into regulations of specific industries, such as we're seeing with this. So this is not carte blanche. It never was carte blanche for the federal government to weigh into industry-specific regulations. And that's what we're seeing. It would be the same as if the federal government would start to target the manufacturing sector specifically, or the transportation sector, or the auto sector. That's what we're seeing with this, and the Supreme Court never indicated that would be acceptable going forward. And that's a very grave concern, obviously, to us as a province.
The judicial issue around it, but I do want to go back on this idea that in effect it's an emissions cap, because would it be, because Stephen Guilbeault makes this argument that methane emissions capture would actually be low cost for oil companies, and that could then be sold as another form of energy. Given that assessment, is it really a cap?
Well, there are real costs attached with this, in terms of equipment, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of tying in of lines, in terms of accommodating, different geology between, for example, Alberta and Saskatchewan. What applies there doesn't necessarily apply to Saskatchewan. There are costs involved, absolutely, and the effort, though, has been very good faith to this point. I think part of it is constantly changing the rules and increasing the percentage. And I think that it's very important to point out that the data collection and data imposition by the federal government, and this is something that we have raised a number of times with counterparts federally, is very smoke and mirrors. That we're never sure what data they are requesting, what models they are imposing. And so one of the things that we have said throughout this process of equivalency and into negotiating a new equivalency agreement is we've got to be very, very transparent as collaborative partners about the data. We've been an open book. You must be as well. And I think that that's part of the uncertainty that comes about as a result of this, that it's very prescriptive. The federal government is starting to talk about specific equipment, audits, and so on. This is provincial jurisdiction. And I think that if the industry right now, you're faced with, again, more uncertainty around, TBD frameworks, which of course have an impact on cost. And in uncertainty, production is affected, period.
So I have less than a minute here, but I do have to ask, where would you like this to go then? Again, these are just draft regulations, not yet finalized. Where does this go from here?
Well, I mean, in Saskatchewan, we have brought out the Saskatchewan First Act, which, as you will know, entrenches in our provincial constitution, our jurisdictional authority under Section 92A of the Constitution over natural resources and power generation. And one of the things that flows from the Saskatchewan First Act is an economic assessment tribunal, and we announced the composition of that last week, which really looks at the harm, the dollar figure harm, and quantifies that for the people of the province and for the country, and so identifies the impact on Saskatchewan of federal policies. And this would be, I think, a prime example of what could be harmful. Certainly it's constitutional overreach. But I think that we'll have to think very hard about referring this to the tribunal for assessment in terms of cost and in terms of really specifying impact on the sector. It's easy to say that cost is of no matter, but of course we never see any costing from the federal government. And so I think that is really the problem. And where there is goodwill that has been shown and good faith that has been shown through collaboration, this would be another example of a unilateral announcement with no collaboration over a sector which has shown very good stewardship in terms of methane emissions. And there are studies which show that if every energy producing nation on earth extracted and regulated their oil and gas the way we do here in Saskatchewan, global greenhouse gas emissions from the energy sectors would instantly fall by 25%. And that a lot of that work has been around methane. We have been good at it, we have reduced it, and there is no need to impose more unilateral percentage hikes just for kicks.
Minister Bronwyn, Eyre, always appreciate the time. Thank you for this evening.
Thank you very much.